Great. So I'm so excited to have Julianne Stanz here. We actually just wrapped on her course on forming missionary disciples in parishes and creating that kind of culture change. Really exciting stuff. And I've been in a particular way excited throughout this entire process. I mean, we've been working on your course for a while now. Yeah. And I've been excited for that whole process because I think, Julianne is kind of a personal hero of mine. You have to know someone who I think has made an outsized impact in the church in terms of the current conversation and what needs to take place in parishes. And so we're really excited to get a chance to have a conversation today. So Julianne, thanks for being here.
Oh, I'm delighted to be here with you. I'm kind of chuckling to myself as you hear the word hero, and I'm thinking, I'm a mom of 3 kids. That's what drives me.
Yeah, moms are definitely heroes, and you in a variety of ways. I think are someone that I really admire in terms of the work you do for the church. So, we just kind of finished talking about that concept of making missionary disciples, and for those of you who are familiar with Julianne, or even if you're not, you know that you're a consultant to the USCCB's Evangelization and Catechesis Committee. Worked as a diocesan director now for, I think, 12 years, you said. Most recently in a new role at the Diocese of Green Bay as the director of parish life and evangelization. Julianne's worked in parishes. You're a mom of 3. I mean, you're kind of doing it all. How do all those roles kind of interact with each other? Does that ever lead to any funny, chance encounters along the way in terms of?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, I've been in parish work my whole life, and I think that's where the great seed of revival is coming from in the church, which is just so exciting to me, because as I'm in parishes and I'm seeing children grow up and raised in faith, and then we're sending them off to homes, and then I look at sitting at the USCCB and being able to bring that lens of, here are the recipients on the other end of this. This is what we're going to see. This is what we're going to hear. How is that meeting the needs of the church? So I have all of these mom moments that kind of brush up against each other. So I've been a consultant almost for 9 years now with the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, and I've just had such an amazing mentorship through the wisdom of so many great bishops who have helped me understand and unpack the kind of layers of missionary renewal in the church. But they also have met my kids and my family, and so the world of my ministry collides with the world of my family life, and I think that's how it should be. They're not separate. We're not compartmentalized beings. One flows into the other. The family is the building block of the church, and so I've been able to take my family with me on some of these trips and introduce them to folks at the USCCB and kind of give them a lens on what a family looks like that's just trying to live out the call to holiness, trying to live a normal, healthy life and have Christ at the center of that.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we're preaching, right, to people is it's all integrated. Like your family, this is the seedbed for mission in terms of the church. And I remember the first time I became aware of some of your work with the USCCB was at the Convocation for Catholic Leaders in Orlando in 2017. This kind of big event that the church, the bishops put on to cast this vision for the church of foreigners. And you were telling me a story earlier that we were laughing about as we were throughout the course of making your course about you. So you were the MC for that for that whole event, and you had a really great story in there about some of the interactions your son with
Cardinal O'Malley.
Yeah.
So because I have worked for the U.S. bishops for a long time now, so many of them know me and they've seen me, and I'm also from Ireland, so that's always a neat talking point. You'll hear people say, "Oh, my mom was from Ireland," and such. But the Convocation of Catholic Leaders was really unique. It brought together almost 4,000 leaders from all over the country. So the stakes were pretty high. This was about the American church kind of rolling up to Pope Francis's vision of the joy of the gospel. And I was the MC along with Bishop Burns. And so we had a really great interplay with each other in the break sets and stuff. But when we were on. So it was a very, very high pressure time, but it was a time of great joy for me as well. My husband and children were with me and had stayed at the hotel. But of course, they didn't have passes to get into the conference. And my husband is just an incredible person, and he's the backbone of so much of what I do. He and the children, my 3 little children, walked me to the barrier. He hands me my sandwich and my snack, because he does that for me a lot, make sure I'm eating, and I give my kids a kiss. And then all of a sudden, our baby, whose name is Sean Patrick, he's 2 at the time, just kind of takes off through the barrier. And all of the Knights of Columbus, who are working security really well, doing a good job of keeping us safe, it was like their hair was on fire. Would somebody catch that child. I was like, I'm the mom. I'll volunteer. And I'm running down the hall and I'm like, I can't catch him. He is so speedy. So I used my next best gift, which is my voice, to yell, Sean Patrick, you stop right this minute. And all of a sudden I see ahead of me, Cardinal O'Malley turns around and he says, I have not heard anyone address me with that tone of voice since I was a little boy running away from my mom, who was Irish, and his name is Sean Patrick. So
Cardinal Sean Patrick O'Malley. Yeah.
So we made the connection between my son and him. It was just this fun moment in the convocation. And I have moments like that happen to me all the time that are just so joyful for me.
I think that's it, though, as lay people take on an increased role in terms of the church's missionary efforts, and even some of this administration and stuff. Like that's how it should be, right? These things should integrate together. That mission. So I think that's super beautiful. So one of the things I've loved talking about over the last few days is just kind of your whole background, and we've learned so much about you. And you're kind of one of those people that's done everything, just kind of like, it seems like whatever you do, you just kind of end up like doing. I'd love to hear more about, just maybe you could tell people about some of your background, and even like, so you mentioned you're Irish, coming to the States, and maybe even your own personal conversions. Like, what's the Julianne Stanz story a little bit for Yeah,
I don't often talk about that. I do a lot of work with parishes and dioceses all across the country, and a lot of people know kind of the ministry story, but the story of who I am is pretty simple. I grew up in a very small mountainous village called Hackettstown. It's just gorgeous. It's breathtaking. It's in the Wicklow Mountain area, and it's almost idyllic in a sense, but there's no industry in our town, and it's a very poor area. So I grew up seeing a lot of, we wouldn't have recognized it as poverty. We had it enough, and everybody in the town seemed to have enough. But I go back now and I look at how blessed we are here in America and how little we had back then. But we had good family community bonds and very involved grandparents. And, I have 66 first cousins. So our family is large. And my mom was married to an English man. And so learning how people saw my dad helped me become more attuned to culture and the nuances around culture. Particularly, he spoke with a very strong British accent. And I saw how people reacted to him, good and not so good. Our family was pretty typical in that we went to Mass on Sundays, but I wouldn't say there was any particular religiosity evident in the home. Like, we didn't pray before meals. I don't ever remember my parents praying with me at night. I don't even actually remember my mom and dad having a conversation with me about my faith. But I had this experience. My parents sent me and my sister to an all-girls school, 1,200 girls, run by the Sisters of Mercy, who were the most incredible women. I think that was the first time I saw what it meant to be a strong woman of faith and be able to share your faith in a really healthy way. They knew everybody's name in the school, 1,200 kids. They were great. And when I was 16, our religion teacher invited us to go on a pilgrimage. I hadn't even a clue what a pilgrimage was. And she's like, it's a trip, but we're going to be doing some prayer along the way. And so she took like 26 girls to climb Croagh Patrick. And I remember climbing that mountain, and just, it was very tiring. It was very intense. It was very grueling. After I'd stopped joking around with the kids and the girls in my class, I kind of splintered off a little bit on my own just to have some quiet time. And I started really to delve into what was going on in my life. Like, who am I? What do I want to do? Is there more to life? Kind of the general questions that you have as a teenager. And I was sitting, finally, when we got to the top of the mountain, there was just so much joy. And you have to understand, this is the mountain St. Patrick climbed himself, went to prepare himself for his public ministry to the church in Ireland. And so I really didn't know Patrick's story, but I started to learn who Patrick was in the same struggles going up this mountain, seeing people barefoot climbing this mountain to atone for things they had done in their lives, or to atone for things their children had done. It just left a huge impression on me. And I was sitting at the top of the mountain, and the sun was right there. It was just starting to set. And I remember I had this thought, and it had to be the Holy Spirit, because nothing that I had ever been taught in all my years of Catholic school was put together quite like this. And it said, Julianne, God loves you every day. And whether you see that sun come up or set every day, the sun comes up and sets every day, just like God's love. And my mind shifted from the sun, like the physical, the object in the sky, to Jesus Christ. And I thought to myself, do I know how much I am loved? And I sat there and I remember crying. And I wouldn't have had language in terms of what was happening to me at that time, but I would have been, now I would recognize I was going through a conversion. And thankfully, my teacher who was with me at the time recognized what was happening and was able to help me understand this is normal. And so that became the seed of why I wanted to go to school for theology. And so my dream at that stage was to be a history and theology teacher. And after been doing that for a couple of years, I met this priest in college, Professor Owen Cassidy, incredibly gifted man. And he said to me, he challenged me. He said, Julianne, you know a lot about your faith, like from the head, but you need to go out and encounter others. And we were using that term encounter. It's part of our culture of hospitality, culture of encounter. And he said, why don't you take a leap of faith? Just go somewhere totally different. And so I went down to the notice board and there was a job. There was one for Paris. There was one for teaching in China. There was one for teaching in France. And then there was a job for a director of religious education in Rhinelander, Wisconsin. And I sent in my resume, and I think a couple of months later I came here. It was just
amazing.
Crazy. Yeah.
That would be a culture shock. I've been to Rhinelander.
It was totally,
and that'd be a little different than your town in Ireland. Yeah, that's beautiful though. It's kind of interesting. Like some of the stuff you talk about in your course, principles like encounter, conversion, discipleship, mentoring by your teacher, the priest, and like. It's funny how much you look back sometimes and then you can see, and I want to talk about your course in a second and some of the principles there, but how you can see those back in your own story. Like these are they're not like principles the church makes up and recommends to us, but they're just kind of like how it happens. And so
for sure.
In explicating them, we're just unpacking what is kind of the natural progression of growth in faith. So I've been asking, I want to ask you, I've been asking people kind of the same three questions, like ones that I think are a little timely for parish leaders right now in a particular way. So it's no secret that we're living in, kind of a difficult moment culturally, like at large, with the need for renewal and, the advance of secularism and all that stuff you talk about in your course, but then also, internally over the last year or so, with kind of a recent bout of scandals. I want to ask you three questions kind of in light of that. First, let's start with the good. Like what are you seeing right now that gives you a lot of hope in terms of what the Holy Spirit can accomplish through his church still? What are like the signs of hope you see?
I think hope is always found in its people. So, I look at you, Tim, I look at regular mom and dads trying to live out their faith in Jesus Christ and teach their children. I see the greatest signs of hope in a renewed sense of encouragement for young people and young families to keep going, that this is important work that you're doing, that you matter, that you have a place. And I see parishes that really capitalize on the gifts of their people really flourishing. And so I think, our greatest gift is always our people. And so Tim and I look out and I talk to parishes, some of the greatest signs I see are the small, unnoticed steps that people are taking to say, you know what, this is my church. This is Jesus Christ's church, but I'm part of this church too. And I had talked about this a little bit, but in the course, that we're not called to leave when things like this happen. We're called to lead and step up. And I share this image of, I live on the shores of Lake Michigan, so I see storms and I see what it's like to be a boat on the water. And it transported me back to what it must have been like for the disciples to be on the water with Jesus Christ. And the storm is coming. And you read that story of all of a sudden Jesus appears and Peter cries out like, Lord, I think it's a ghost. But if it's you, command me to come on the water. And I've always found this story interesting because actually in one of the translations you hear that Peter actually could walk on water. And so he gets out of the boat and he keeps his eyes fixed on Jesus Christ. And all of a sudden then he starts to look about and the storm is really raging and he starts to sink. And we're told he cries out, this prayer. And I think it's the shortest and most desperate prayer in the Bible, like, Lord, save me. And we're told immediately Jesus caught his hand. And I think about that as an image for where we are as a church right now, that we're being called to step out of our boat. And we're being called not to focus on the storm, on all the issues that we're facing, but to focus on Jesus Christ, who will catch us. And so the greatest sign for me of hope is people who are stepping out of the boat and knowing that the Lord Jesus is there and willing to take that step anyway. And I just think that is a real sign of encouragement to us as a church.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah, I do. I think there's a lot of those really beautiful kind of pithy sayings from Peter that can be powerful to people in ministry. What's the one after the bread of life discourse where Peter's like, who else would I go? There's almost like a part of him, you can almost hear him saying a little bit like, well, is there another option? But there's that's kind of what it means. You dive in, you're all in. Okay, good. So signs of hope and the people who are stepping out of the boat and acting faith. What's one thing? Because I think this is an interesting question, because I think everyone had, there's so many elements to this renewal that's necessary. That's part of what this platform is kind of about, is like speaking to all those different areas and really helping people level up in all of them. But I think everyone has kind of a slightly different take on some things that are really can be done now. So I'd be interested to hear what would be your, one, maybe two things that the church could do right now. You would love to see if if the church could only do X, that would be a great step in the right direction. Maybe both in terms of the church at large, but maybe also in our parishes and in our, I'd be interested to hear.
Yeah, I think, as we look at the global church, I think one of the things that we're hearing consistently is about being the hands and feet of Jesus Christ and reaching out and being merciful. And I think about how the culture of toxic social media is chewing up the mental health of our young people, and how the vision that's put forward, particularly for young people, but especially women, is very self-centered, and it's narcissistic and it's empty. It's interesting. My niece has been living with us this summer from Ireland, and she's 17 years of age, and she's been talking to me a lot about this, how there is no place where you can go to put your sad face. The world sees your happy face, it sees your game face, but it doesn't see what's really going on. And I think the church can offer a narrative to not just mediate that, but to redeem it and offer hope around that the beauty and the gift of the human person finds its fullest expression in being called to imitate Jesus Christ. And young people are interested in it, but I think we have to find a way to speak into that concern, that need, and that situation in their lives that they feel like they're floundering. So I think as a church, we need to do better at speaking the gospel into real people's lives. I think we're really good at telling them, come and learn. We got some great classes for you. You can learn about the Bible. You can learn about these things. But what about you've anxiety? Come and talk. Let's talk. Let's have a conversation. So I think youth ministry groups are a great example of this. They do a lot of this naturally with young people. Let's talk about what's happening in the culture. Let's talk about, for example, the mass shootings that we're experiencing as a culture in the United States. How do you speak the gospel into a place where people are utterly scared to go to school or church, and how to have a thoughtful, gospel-centered conversation? I think we as a church can do better at bridging the gap between faith learning and faith living. In terms of parishes, I think there's a number of things that they can do, but it's really, how well do they know their people? How well do they understand the nuances of the community? And I think that's one of the growth edges for us, is to be able to really look at the unique needs of the people in our local area and say, what do we as a church have to offer? One of the challenges I've been offering parishes is, if you closed your parish door, what would happen to your neighborhood? That should really be a jolt for some people. You are at the center of a neighborhood here, and yet you're telling me that maybe most people wouldn't notice at all, except for the 150 that are coming to Mass. Huge challenge for us. And it's a huge tension creator for parishes, where we're actually even afraid sometimes to think about what that means. Our parishes are supposed to be centers of missionary activity that send us out. They're sanctuaries. We are blessed where we receive nourishment through the sacraments, where we can be nourished in the truth, but we're also places where we can send people forth from. I think we don't do the sending well. And so sometimes we have this kind of mindset, which I talk about in the course, still seeping into Catholicism of pray, pay, and obey. I show up and I leave. And it's what are you taking with you that can nourish someone else? How can you take that seed of the gospel you heard in the scriptures today and nourish your family, or share in a realistic and kind of healthy way something that struck you with your neighbor? That's what we're talking about, is getting people to come out and see the parish as the place that forms them and then mobilizes them for mission.
Well, and then that missionary impulse even influences the way that formation proceeds, right? Like there's when you have to play the football game, you're going to practice a little bit harder, right? Like they go together, right?
You're making a great point for me. Like if you want to teach people how to love a game, you don't sit down with a manual. Like I was a swimmer. It's something my dad and our whole family is connected around the water, but my dad never taught me to swim by reading me a manual or like saying, here's the basic principles of whatever. Like he taught us some basic safety principles around water, but then we learned to swim by swimming with him. And I think the same is true of our faith. Like we've done a really great job. We've an amazing intellectual patrimony, treasures of the church. We've got so much in terms of our intellectual treasures, but also we've got an incredible history of 2,000 years of taking care of the poor and the marginalized. How people become Christians is often in the apprenticeship and the living out of the faith and the mentoring. And that's where I think our parishes often rely on a programmatic approach rather than a person-centered approach, more of a relational approach.
Yeah, it's challenging. It's scary to step into. I think the great examples of the saints, though, it's always the both and. You think of the Mother Teresa's and the Maximilian Kolbe, right? Incredibly learned, but like knows how to put some feet to it, or John Paul in the mountains with all of his as a young priest. Like it's always that both and feeding each other. Third question.
Yeah.
So in this kind of idea of culture, and one of the things I've noticed personally, I think this is why I asked this question, is I've had a lot of conversations with parish leaders over the last year or so that in a particular way are feeling discouraged right now. I think, mostly just because it's hard to be trying to navigate the waters of a secular culture, but in a unique way because of some of the failures in leadership that like they've seen over the last year or two of scandal,
For sure.
And you as somebody who works in a diocesan office, I think can speak powerfully to what you're seeing and maybe what you would say to those parish leaders that are kind of like struggling to hold on a little bit, wondering if there's if the cavalry's coming, like if there's hope.
Yeah, and I like that image of the cavalry because that's actually something parishes will often use. We're at the front lines. Who's going to help and bring relief? And so, as I travel out amongst parishes, there's a couple of things that I see repeatedly: the demoralization and the loss of a sense of feeling nourished in their ministries. I've noticed it started to escalate with the crisis. I think what's interesting is for the at least in terms of what we can gather from data and from anecdotal evidence, the recent scandals, as they stretch back, for many Catholics, they're just like, oh, this is one scandal among many. Oh, Dallas, Boston, wherever. They say, well, that is typical. This is happening all the time. And so they kind of disconnect and they assume that it's just an ongoing pattern of cover-up and abuse and a failure in leadership that's just part of an overall, issue in the church, which it is. But I noticed that there was a bit of a nuance with this specific crisis because it was aimed so directly at the failures in leadership and the cover-up that connected Catholics and parish leaders were more even deeply affected because many Catholics were saying, oh, yeah, we're hearing things ripple out from wherever, so we're just turning off the news and just ignoring it. But because our engaged and committed Catholics, our faithful Catholics are plugged into our news outlets and plugged into, our media cycles, they were hearing more of the details of the abuse, and the abuse, obviously the failure went all the way to the top in many cases. And so that has affected them much more deeply than I think even, the debut of the scandals back with the Dallas Charter in 2002. We know this isn't a new problem in the church because it's not a new problem in the world. But I think for our parish leaders, the idea that the leadership of the church or the bishops could be so directly implicated in certain situations was so hard for them to grasp. And so I think it's important for parish leaders to recognize, that there is always hope, that Jesus Christ is the center of our life and the center of our church, and he calls us forth to recommit our lives to him. So this call to holiness isn't this fluffy concept in the church, but this is a real thing. And when life gets tough, you've got a choice here. You can double down and you can kind of keep putting your feet one step in front of the other, or you can get out. And unfortunately, we've seen some people make the decision, say, I cannot be part of this ministry anymore. I just feel too ground down. And I understand that, and it's an unfortunate reality. But I also know that ministers who are ministers never take their gifts away from the church. They're just expressed in a different way. They nourish their families. Even in their secular lives, they find a way to encourage people and support people. They reach out, they invite people to Mass. For those parish leaders that are still hanging in there, keep going. You are doing incredible work and you're making a difference. The story that the media tells is not the story I see every day. And even when it comes to the bishops of the United States, the story is far more deep and nuanced. I think about a particular bishop that I know, when somebody on his staff loses a loved one, he calls that person and their family to express his condolences. Or the bishop who spends his free afternoons visiting children who are dying in their families in hospice. You never hear those stories. And so I tell Catholics, especially Catholic leaders, don't let the media tell the story for you. The Catholic media is us today. We have a platform on our Facebook groups, on our social media, and our Twitter and whatever. Tell the story of who the Lord Jesus is working in your ministry, in your lives. That is the best witness that you can give in a time of tragedy, in a time of scarcity where you feel like things are dwindling. That's the real story of how the Lord is moving.
Wow, I love that. Yeah, the renewed encounter. And I think in your course, you give a lot of the antidote and the solution, and it's something that I hope we kind of turn our focus back to. Even one of the things you mention is even to pastors, really focusing on their leadership team, and to staffs, really focusing on maybe your catechists or your core, really like your circle of influence, to use a Patrick Lencioni term, like the people closest to you, like pour into them first. Maybe you could give us kind of a little preview. So your course is on making missionary disciples, and even more than that, I would say that this is, it's speaking to a cultural moment that like this is kind of the mandate for the church right now. It's supposed to be a shift from maintenance to mission that's happening in our parishes. What kind of like led you to that passion for that topic? Like how's that developed?
It developed because I'm in parishes all the time. I'm a lector at my parish and I'm on my parish council and I help my parish with their social media pages. Ever since I came to the United States, you have to remember like leaving home is traumatic for people. So like your home base, your home country, and coming to another country, that's traumatic. And the one thing that I found that was consistent was Catholicism for me. So I remember waking up in America and smelling coffee being brewed. Like that is not something that I ever grew up with in Ireland. It was always the whistle of the kettle in the morning that woke me up, like my mom was making tea. And so when I came over to this country, everything was so different for me except Catholicism. It was the one thing that stayed the same in terms of I could recognize my place in this and a way to connect with the parishes. So I've developed a passion for parishes just throughout my whole ministry. I was a director of religious education, youth ministry. I worked in adult faith formation and RCIA. I've been really blessed to have been able to kind of get involved in pastoral care life. And then in working at the diocese, I went from working in adult faith formation to young adult ministry to then actually directing one of the first departments of new evangelization in the country. And like everybody was asking, what did that mean? And for us, it was always about reproposing the gospel in this new context, in this postmodern world that was hope-filled and faithful. And so we were coaching our parishes. Well, then after that, I was asked to be director of discipleship and leadership development. So I went through a leadership development process with actually our bishop and 15 of us to figure out how to help organizations become more discipleship-oriented and also develop smart leadership practices. My new position, these have all kind of run up together, is Director of Parish Life and Evangelization. So everything that I've had to do, kind of the coaching around, the ministerial reality that you're working with, coaching your catechists, helping disciple and invest in your catechists, also working with your leadership team. It's all kind of come to bear for me at this moment in the church. And for this course, I think what's particularly great about it is we're going to help parishes look at their unique needs, and we identify principles, processes, and practical tips. And I think the principles that we want to root our missionary discipleship renewal in are the scriptural and biblical and church-oriented processes so that everybody can have a common framework from which to trellis their renewal. And then we're going to look at processes that have worked for other parishes, and then the practical means by which you can implement them. And then we're going to flex them for your parish situation. One of the things I feel really passionate about, Tim, is that you don't just take a recipe, like a cake you're baking, and just grafted onto your parish and wonder why it's not working. That like I give this image in the course of like it being a stew. Like a stew is very Irish, like it's a casserole if you're in the Midwest, right? Or you just kind of take whatever
the
you've
Rhinelander
got.
And
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Like
good.
you take your casserole in the Midwest and like whatever you got goes into it. And that's what our parishes are like. They're composed of all different elements. And so missionary discipleship is multifaceted because our parishes are. And so this course doesn't do like a one size fits all. It's more like an Etsy approach, like more boutique, like you can choose this principle and flex it for your parish, or maybe this one is not going to be as effective as this one. So we're going to go for this one. And so I'm really excited that parishes can learn kind of from the wisdom of what's been shared with me from parish leaders. Really, I'm sharing back what's been given to me in the field with them. And that's really exciting for me.
Yeah, we're in Denver, home of the millennials filming this. So it's a very bespoke approach. I think would be the way that they would talk about it. But yeah, I think that's what's our senior producer here at Revive wrote me a note at one point while you were giving one of your things, and he was like, "Does she have a photographic memory?" Because I've never seen anyone quote. I mean, like so that you talked about principles that are biblical but also church based, and nobody can quote a papal document like you can. I mean, it's just amazing. But then it's at the end, you're like talking just super practical in your parish because you're driving around all these places actually talking about what needs to be done. Like you do both really well, which I think is a real gift to be able to translate it into action, but to still pull from principles that are eternal.
Oh, thanks for sharing that. I'm going to tell you, in 2008, I bought a Toyota Corolla, and I bought it. I had 24,000 miles on it. I still have that same car. It's got 297,000 miles. And so, yeah, that car takes me, grocery shopping and things. But most of those miles have been spent in being out amongst the parishes. And so being on the road, helping parishes out is this real passion of mine. And I want to be able to share with parishes, the wisdom of what's been shared with me, but also, the wisdom of the church. I'm a little bit of a document nerd. There's so much richness in, the writings of the church and the doctors of the church, the saints, and but how to apply them to your life. I mean, I'm raising 3 children. That's part of my motivation. I want to leave for my children a church that was better for them than it was for me. And what I mean by that is growing up in Ireland, you go to Mass on Sunday and there is no youth group, there is no Bible study, there's very, very little. That's starting to change now in the church, but I want one of the great gifts that the American Catholic Church has is this great spirit of optimism and entrepreneurship in a way. Like if there's not something there, we're going to create it. And I really, really admire that. I often tell people Ireland is my homeland, but America is my heartland because you just have this heart that's generous and I want the best of that for my children. So that's what drives me.
That's a cool practical tip. Like buy a Corolla. If you're a diocesan director, buy a Corolla and put a lot of miles on it.
If you're a parish leader, buy a Corolla.
But that's like the modern day like wearing out. Who was that? There was that priest in who would like his shoes would get worn out from the days of walking down the hot streets. I forget what his name was, but that's like the contemporary
but
equivalent of that.
But the disciples would have been the same. I mean,
right.
they would have had their sandals worn down. This is the same way. Like we have to extend our presence into people's lives, whether it's by social media. But I think that's another thing actually we talk a lot in the course about is how presence and encounter are so closely related. And that is another gift that we as a Catholic Church can give. We can give the presence of ourselves as a way to walk out the gospel to someone else, that encounter with us is an encounter with Jesus Christ, and then we can lead them to the source of that encounter, which is Jesus Christ. And there's no greater encounter than you can find in the Eucharist, to be actually nourished bodily, soul, and divinity. And so we have so much to give.
Yeah. I'll probably step all over this question. It'll probably be a little clunky, so forgive me. But I think one of the things I admire about you is you're an incredible leader, doing amazing things for the church, and you're really an exemplar for an important thing, which I think is you're a female leader in a in a particular way. Like we talked about a mom and I'm asking it terribly, aren't I? You know where Jim. I'm going though.
I do.
Yeah. So I just think that's a really important topic today. Like I have a lot of friends who that's a big question. Be like female parish leaders or just friends who are like kind of wanting to know what's the role of women in the church? Is there an openness to that kind of shared leadership? And I think it's something you are an exemplar of. So I'd love to hear you kind of just some of that, maybe your experience of that as being a woman in leadership in the church, but then also where you see that going and the vision for that?
This is really interesting, yeah. And I know you're tipping around it, but this is such a dodgy question, like we would say in Ireland, because it's fraught with controversy. Because unfortunately, people go to the extremes when they talk about women in leadership in the church. And I don't want to go there, because I think, to me, that's where the conversation pops and fizzles. Where I think there's great energy is around women in leadership and how to create pathways for them. And this is actually a conversation that the U.S. bishops are going to pick up. So 3 years ago, Bishop Barron was elected chair of the Committee on Catechesis, or Committee on Evangelization and Catechesis, better say that right. And in my very first meeting with him, I talked about how women between the ages of 18 and 34 are one of the fastest growing disenfranchised groups within the church.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah, it was really interesting. We've been talking a lot about men and vocations and things like that. And I just wanted to kind of offer that women have always kind of had historically higher levels of engagement in the church than men, but it's starting to really kind of fall, and now it's kind of leveling off. Men's level of engagement has historically been lower, but has remained steady. But what was interesting is our engagement level was always higher and now has fell. And so I wanted to talk about that with the bishops, and I just had made this comment. And what was interesting was Bishop Barron followed up with me and said, "Can you talk to me more about that?" And I did, and I chatted about what women are running corporations in their 20s. They are creating incredible platforms for people to share their ideas, and that there's I really believe that St. John Paul II's beautiful quotes on the church needs this maternal, relational offering that women bring, and he talks about the feminine genius and all of that. I think that's so important for young women to hear, because one of the things, Tim, that really has made me sad, and I've done this almost every large gathering for catechetical leaders over the last 10 years, I've asked, hands up in the room, anyone here that when they were a little girl or a guy wanted to become a director of religious education? And I've never had anyone raise their hand. And so, people wander into positions in the church in all kinds of ways. Sometimes they're asked by a pastor or a friend who say, "Hey, you'd be good at this." But we don't create pathways of leadership for young people, and especially for young women. And so, I've been a young adult at the USCCB and had to say, "Hey, you're talking about this, and I'm not sure a mom of 3 kids would actually pick that document up or this pamphlet," and just offer a real perspective. What's been interesting is how open, in fact, the Committee on Evangelization and Catechesis has been in terms of having the conversation and inviting me into the conversation. And so I've had, as a result of just been able to live out my vocation as a mom and a wife, been able to share just authentically the struggles. I think that's another thing. We want to talk about our glory stories a lot, but we don't want to talk about, the things that have really been hard for us. And women need a place. All people need a place where they can come together and have shared conversation. So this November, actually, surprise, this is a little surprise I can share with you all, a little sneak peek.
Is this breaking news?
Oh,
great.
Yeah. At the General Assembly, there's going to be almost like a little documentary that's been produced for the U.S. bishops around engaging the nuns, those who typically check the box of unaffiliated. And I will be one of the panelists actually for that event, and I was one of their featured presenters. And the issue I spoke to actually was women in the church. So so in November, there's going to be an opportunity for the bishops to see that documentary around engaging young people and kind of groups we don't typically think about in the church. But then there's going to be a complementary resource that's produced where all parishes can kind of sit around together and watch it and talk about how they're creating a space for people to come into leadership in the church, whether they're young men or women or whatever that looks like. And I think that's really exciting.
Praise God. I mean, as a millennial, so I want to talk about myself, right? As a millennial, but I do feel like there's this attempt sometimes in the church where we want to see what's the one thing that's just going to bring all the millennials back. And what I love about you, because of your experiences, is everything for you comes back to individuals and in the context of the parish. It's not just every millennial wants X, every millennial wants X, and if we just kind of hit that switch, they're all going to come rushing back into this church, But in reality, it's going to come from encountering people in our local churches and walking with them, and like you said, opening pathways to leadership and all that stuff. It has to happen at that local level for it to be really effective. And
I agree, and I think this is one thing that a good parish team needs to look at its own health in terms of leadership. And I sometimes say that, I pray every morning, Lord, keep me safe, keep me close to you, keep me so I always know you're near me, keep me under the radar, keep me just connected to the, to being out with folks who are, the salt of the earth, the best of what America has to offer in the simplicity. And so I always pray for simplicity. And my husband and I try and live live simply so that others might simply live, quote from Mother Teresa, which is why my car has almost 300,000 miles on it. But because, at its root, we are a people who crave and desire simplicity. And so I think, we sometimes make the solutions far more complex than they need to be. And I also think that they're like any demographic you talk about in the church. When you talk about millennials instead of speaking with them, and I think even beyond that, listening to them. And I often say to people, listening does not just mean being quiet and taking things in. It means being present. And so how do we as a church be present authentically to what is going on with millennials as people? What are their needs? What are they trying to tell us? How can we listen differently for what they're saying to us? That's really something we've got to take on board. Yeah,
I think you're right, where listening sometimes we think of it almost, we hear that and we think of it as something like inherently so like I'm like an evangelist at heart, right? And I love like the intellectual side of the faith. Mm-hmm. That was something that was really important for me in my formation and coming to know the Lord better and stuff. And so it can be hard for me sometimes to like be quiet long enough, to like I want to get my.
I'm with you.
But like there's a listening is not just for the sake of, like you said, being quiet and never offering the answers that the church provides, either in terms of moral questions, but more specifically the answer, like Jesus Christ, the answer to all your human longings. But that listening creates an openness in terms, and it's a tactic of the evangelist to understand, like you talk about in the course, like where's the pain point? Like where does the gospel meet this person's life?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think, I said this in the course, but pain that's not transformed is transferred. And we see that all over the place in our culture. And I think adopting that posture of listening allows us to really practice what Pope Francis says in the art of accompaniment, which takes off our sandals, which is a really interesting metaphor, and sets them at the feet of the other. And kind of taking ourselves of the world of who we are instead of asking, who is this person? Who has God created this person? Who's already present in this person's life? And so we don't bring Jesus to people. We are instruments cooperating with the Holy Spirit. We bring gifts of joy and we bring our story and we bring those, but Jesus is already present in that person's life. God the Father has created that child already. And so how to cultivate an awareness for that person of, like, you might completely not identify as Christian at all, but you have been created by a loving God for relationship and you long for that, even though you might not know it. And how to create an awareness for someone where they can see themselves in this larger story.
Yeah. Like, was it John Paul Redemptor Homines was his first encyclical, right? Like, man is humanity, I should say, is the pathway of the church. So I think that's one of
my favorite documents, by the I
Yeah, underrated. Yeah, we'll do that. We'll do like Julianne's top 5 favorite encyclicals after this, because I'm convinced you have them all memorized.
I do.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. So one of the things I love is, and we've talked about it a little bit already, we've kind of touched on it, but I'm pretty convicted about, like, one of the things my wife and I have talked a lot about is almost like, Paul's, if I speak with human and angelic tongues, but I don't have love, like, translated to our family life, if we're out there, both of us have a really missional heart and we love to do stuff but we've been really convicted about, like, the first seedbed of evangelization for us is our own prayer lives, and then our family, how we raise our kids, how we love one another. And so with your family, I'd kind of be interested to hear, like, for people who are listening, who are parish leaders and have families and kind of want to know how to integrate the two, or are just, Catholics that are trying to, like, live this well and raise their families well and form disciples in their homes. What's some of the stuff that what's some of your secret sauce in the Stanz household?
Well, it's like, I use this analogy in the course, but, like, you don't wake up and be 10 pounds overweight, which I was when I came here because I ate all of the American foods I'd never tried before. But, like,
they don't have Taco Bell in?
No.
Oh, okay.
and brownies and all that good stuff. But it's a series of small steps. So if you want to practice disciple making, you start with your children now. And so many parents say to me, I just don't know how to talk to my children about the faith. Like, I feel like I don't know it all. So there's that issue. And then I don't know how to talk to my kids in a real way. And so, I'll point to these like ordinary everyday moments that you have to shape your children's lives. And one that's really simple and really practical is like, we're getting ready for going back to school. And when you're getting ready for going back to school, you often get new clothes for your kids or new shoes. Because, I think about my kids, they wear out their summer sandals. Now they need, the sneaks or the shoes. And so we bless their shoes. So we bless their shoes, and then we sit them on the bench that we have in our kitchen before they go to school on their first day, and we make the sign of the cross on their feet and say, may Jesus Christ guide your steps today. And as you put on these new shoes, this is a new opportunity for you to be Jesus, to speak Jesus, to be the hands and feet of Jesus to your students, and to be good students in the classroom. So really simple things like that, I think, can have a huge impact on children. Praying with your children is really important. So many parents say to me, but we do mealtime prayer. And I'm like, but actually like stepping out and saying, son, what's going on in your life today? Like, you've got a test. Okay, we're just going to take a moment right now and we're going to ask the Lord to help you with that. Modeling that Jesus Christ is a part of everyday moments of your life. Like, I think of Brother Lawrence of the Resurrection, and he talks about like Jesus is the Lord of the pots and the pans. And I love that image. Like, it speaks to me as I'm washing the dishes in the evening after. How can those ordinary everyday moments be transformed by the grace of Jesus Christ? And so, and then taking opportunities when you're looking at the liturgical year to really ask why you're doing some of these things. So like one that, it's kind of an odd one, but I'm going to mention it anyway. The elf on the shelf is something that I kind of don't like.
Okay.
Because to me, it's like it robs us of some of the beauty of Advent. And so I talk to parents, like, if you want to do something like elf on the shelf, why don't you do something like Advent angels? And so take the best of our tradition and flex it in a way for your family. If you do elf on the shelf, I'm totally not condemning you here, but I just want to share with you how, like, the culture is going to take every moment it can from us. It took Valentine's Day. It's taken St. Patrick's Day. It's taken these holy moments from us. Let's not allow that to happen anymore, but let's reclaim them, these moments with our families for Jesus Christ.
Beautiful. I love it. And if people want to send angry emails about Elf on the Shelf,
I have gotten those.
Great. Well, good. Well, this has been a joy. If you want to find Julianne's course, it's on the Revive platform now. You can subscribe to your parish, and you can access Julianne's course and every other course from all of our these amazing masterclass. In different aspects of parish life. Julianne's has been particularly inspiring personally, just having listened to her already recording it over the last couple of days, and so I'm really excited for parish leaders to be able to access that. Is there anything anywhere else that parish leaders, if they want to hear more of what is kind of burns on your heart for the church, where can they find more of that? Great question. So in my spare time, of which I have none, I've written a couple of books. My new book is Start with Jesus. So there's some great ideas in there. I also write a monthly column called A Space for Grace in our local Catholic newspaper, and you can find that online. I'm on Facebook, but you can always email me. My stuff is out there. I'd love to hear from you. Don't be afraid to just shoot me an email and say, or call me at my office line in Green Bay and say, look, here, we're looking at something in our parish. Can you give me your eyes and your ears on that? I'm happy to share whatever I got for the good of the kingdom. Good. And those at Loyola Press, right? Is Start with Jesus? I should mention that. Loyola Press is my publisher of Start with Jesus, How Everyday Disciples Will Renew the Church. For catechetical leaders, I wrote one called Developing Disciples of Christ, and that's got some great disciple-making principles. That was Loyola Press. And if you're a catechist and listening to this, Joe Paprocki and I wrote the Catechist Backpack, and that was also published by Loyola Press. Great. Yeah, good. No problem. Yeah. Good. Loyola Press, Toyota. We've gotten all of our hits there. Good. Great. Well, Julianne, thanks so much for being with us, and be praying for you in your work in the Diocese of Green Bay and with the USCCB. Thanks so much. Thanks, and God bless everyone. God bless you for all the good work that you're doing.